Good morning, U.S. history class. So the schedule for this week, kind of the plan is we are going to do some YouTube lectures. You'll be seeing this on YouTube. I'm recording these. I will post them to YouTube at the end. There will be a couple discussion questions that I will leave for you, and those will be your assignments. And I'll point out all that out to you in the email, but that is the sort of the plan for this week. Last week, you guys talked about the war effort on the home front. You looked at kind of what Americans were doing at home to help prepare for the war, buying wartime bonds, rationing. You talked about the Manhattan Project, which was the group who started the testing for the atomic bomb. Now we're going to look at the actual war going on. First, we're going to look at Europe and North Africa in Section 5, and then in Section 6, we will look at the war in the Pacific. But the war in Europe starts with sort of an alliance between the United States and Britain. We talked about with the Atlantic Charter, President FDR of the United States and Prime Minister Winston Churchill of Britain. They have their alliance in the Atlantic Charter, and they decide to go for a Germany first strategy, just simply due to the fact that they posed a larger threat. They were more dangerous than a country like Italy, so Italy wasn't as important in this time. So they both decide that they're going to go after Germany first. This leads to, first, the Battle of the Atlantic. If you remember, early on in the war, Germany takes over France, and the Allies have no territory in Europe to kind of base themselves from. So there is the Battle of the Atlantic. And this kind of started right after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the United States joining the war in order to kind of throw the United States into a tough situation. Hitler decides to send out his U-boats and attack American cruise liner ships that are going through the Atlantic Ocean, trying to kind of hurt them on both ends. And so the Battle of Atlantic was simply just a large group of naval battles between Allied navies and the German U-boats. A large factor for the Allies was something called sonar, which it allowed the Allies to use kind of like radar for the Air Force. Sonar could detect German U-boats. They could plan kind of where they were going, their paths, their movement, and then also detect attacks. They could detect missiles that were moving through the water. They could tell if they were coming towards them, allowing them to prepare for attack. And by using this, it allowed them to sort of gain a victory, so to speak. By mid-1943, excuse my alarm there if you could hear that. But by mid-1943, the tides had turned, no pun intended, in favor of the Allies, and they had finally gained a little bit of hope on the Western Front in Europe. Going to the Eastern Front, if you remember, this would have been quite a few lessons ago. Hitler makes a big mistake and breaks his non-aggression treaty and attacks the Soviet Union. And that's right away in 1941. Sort of the first major battle would be the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad was sort of an important place. There's a lot of major oil fields in the area. It's in the Caucasus Mountains. And Hitler was hoping to capture these oil fields. He needed them for his Luftwaffe for the Blitzkrieg attacks. He needed a large amount of oil for those to continue to be successful, and so he was looking to capture these oil fields and then use that oil for his own war plans. This battle, it was during the winter of 1941 and into early 1942. So it was a cold battle, a lot of casualties on both sides. It would last about 4 months. Russia lost a large amount of soldiers, more soldiers than the actual United States would lose during the whole entire World War II. But despite these large amount of losses, they were able to force Germany to surrender, and it marked a turning point for the East. Looking south now in North Africa, it's just sort of a little short blip there. You have General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who ends up becoming president later on, but he plays a very important part in World War II. He begins with Operation Torch, which looked to go through the Mediterranean Sea and invade North Africa. Italy and other Axis powers had territories in North Africa. So they looked to go through the Mediterranean, invade North Africa, and then move on to Europe. There is actually a map on page 540 if you would like to kind of take a look at what Operation Torch entailed. You see it begins November 8th, 1942. They come in through the Mediterranean to the countries of Morocco and Algeria in cities such as Casablanca and Algeria. And after 6 months of fighting, the Allies gain victory, and from there they move on towards Italy. Excuse that little line or the text behind there. I don't have the play button pulled up, so it shows kind of everything on the background. But sort of even before the Battle of North Africa was won by the Allies, they had determined that they were only going to accept an unconditional surrender. What they wanted here was basically they wouldn't accept any terms for the Axis powers. They wanted them to fully surrender and basically do whatever they told them to do after that point. And sort of meetings between Allied forces, Winston Churchill, Stalin, and President Roosevelt decided on sort of two plans. Mainly, Stalin wanted action done quickly because he didn't know how long his forces could hold up on the Eastern Front. So he asked for France or what was left of the French troops, as well as Britain and the United States, to act quickly in order to sort of help him out. And there was two major plans that they had come up with. First, their plan was to attack across the English Channel, attack into France, and then after conquering France, move into Germany, which sort of, spoiler alert, that's sort of the plans for DDay. And secondly, their thought was to attack up through Italy and after conquering Italy, they would be able to move relatively unopposed up into Germany. They favored the Italian campaign fairly well, mainly because it would be a lot easier to move up through Italy than try and land on France with absolutely no territory. And I mean, you kind of know what happens at D-Day. They didn't know how successful they would be able to be doing something such as that. And so they make their decision to go through Italy. The Italian campaign starts, and they capture Sicily relatively quickly. Sicily is a small island off the coast of Italy. But they're able to capture Sicily, and at this point, the Italian government, they arrest Benito Mussolini, they strip him of his power, and they throw him in jail. So Benito Mussolini, after July 25th, 1943, is no longer in power of Italy. At this point, the United States continues, or the United States and Britain, the Allied powers, they continue moving up through Britain, or not Britain, Italy, excuse me. But Hitler was still determined to stop them from completely conquering Italy. At this point, because Mussolini was stripped of his power, Italy not really putting up much of a fight anymore, they're just kind of letting it go. But Hitler did not want that. He did not want to have to fight World War II inside of German borders. He wanted to keep it outside of Germany as much as possible. So you have the Battle of Bloody Anzio, a 4-month-long battle in Italy, results in 25,000 Allied casualties and 30,000 Axis casualties. This battle goes up until May 1944, so just right before the D-Day landings in France. Although there was large amounts of casualties from both sides, Germany would not give up Italy, and sort of fighting in Italy would continue all the way through 1944 and into 1945, just a short period before the fall of Nazi Germany. Next, we're going to look at some heroes in combat. That's what the header in your book is on page 541. Sort of 3 different groups who were important to combat in World War II. First of all, you had sort of the most well-known group, the Tuskegee Airmen. This was a group of all African-American fighter pilots. They were trained in Tuskegee, Alabama, hence the name Tuskegee Airmen. And they were also the only U.S. escort group in World War II who did not lose lose a single bomber to enemy fire during the entire war. My alarm again, sorry for that. But the Tuskegee Airmen, very successful in World War II, very helpful towards the Allied forces during all of World War II. You have another all-black unit, the 92nd Infantry. They were also nicknamed the Buffaloes. They were a very decorated unit. They showed a lot of courage under fire. They won 7 Legion of Merit Awards, 65 Silver Stars, as well as 162 Bronze Stars for their courage under fire. And a third unit was the 100th Battalion, which, sort of surprising at this time, a unit of all Japanese Americans, made up of 1,300 Nisei Japanese. If you remember back to, that would have been the last section, I believe. sort of the placing of Asian Americans into internment camps. So this unit is extra special due to the persecution against Asian Americans at this time. They were able to show success in World War II. This group became known as the Purple Heart Battalion. And once they were merged into the 442nd Regimental, they became the most decorated unit in American history, meaning the most awards were given to them in over any unit in U.S. history. But back to the fighting going on, and this is sort of setting up the stage for the end of World War II. It begins with the Turan Conference, or the Turan Conference, sorry. And what this was a meeting between all of the Allied leaders in Tehran, the capital of Iran, and they were coming up with a strategy on what they were going to do next. This meeting was in late 1943, and they basically determined that the Soviets, still fighting in the East, would continue to attack in the East, and the other Allies would invade across the English Channel on the beaches of Normandy, France. The plan for this invasion was called Operation Overlord. George C. Marshall, general, was given the power of planning the attack. He was also asked to lead it, but he decided not to lead it. He did not want to lead such an invasion. And so he selects sort of our big guy, Dwight D. Eisenhower, to lead this invasion into France. And sort of just a sidetrack as well, with the tensions rising and the amount of time it took for the Allies to plan this attack, you started to see more tension between the United States and Britain with the Soviet Union. The Soviets not happy with how long they were taking. They didn't know how long they were going to be able to hold up on the East. And so you see a lot of resentment and tension between those two countries, which leads to later problems with the Cold War. But we are setting the stage for D-Day. And on June 6th, 1944, the attack is finally led into France, led by General Omar Bradley. So Dwight D. Eisenhower, he was tasked with planning the invasion and sort of setting it up. Going back a slide here. He was planning to lead the invasion, but he was not on hand. Obviously, they wanted to protect him. They didn't want him to die in this attack. And so he gives power to Omar Bradley to lead the troops who land at Normandy. So Allied forces, they invade the 5 different breaches at Normandy, France. There's a map on page 544 of the invasion. You see they come across from Britain. They come across the English Channel and they attack France. They are able to successfully overtake the Normandy beaches. And at this point, they're able to recreate a two-front war in Europe. And at this time, an amphibious landing was pretty much insane, being able to attack through water and then attack up onto land. And if any of you have seen the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, you see just how difficult it was. German machine gunners perched up on this hill in their towers, just firing down onto the Allied forces attacking the beach, and they had basically little to no cover. There was a quote I saw somewhere that says they would drop and hide behind anything the size of a pin needle, just anything to get out of the way of enemy fire. But it was a very difficult invasion, and it ended up being successful. It took over 2 years of planning in order to make it successful. It's probably one of the greatest military feats at this time. But following D-Day, you have General Patton and his Third Army. They continue advancing through France, and just a few short months later, on August 25th, they're able to liberate Paris, and basically gaining France back for the Allies. And they continue their movement. In October of 1944, they occupy their first German town, Aachen. And once Hitler receives news of Aachen, he starts to get a little worried. Obviously, like I mentioned before, he does not want to fight this war in Germany. And so at this point, he goes to launch his last major offensive, and that is the Battle of the Bulge. He wanted to break through Allied lines, and he wanted to capture the Bulge, which between Germany and Belgium, there's a bulge that comes in, and that's kind of what the bulge means. And so we wanted to capture this bulge, and so the fighting would move itself outside of Germany yet again. So he launches this attack in December. It's a heavy casualty war, or battle. It starts out, Hitler sort of overtakes an American unit and basically marches them as prisoners out into a large field and just murders them all. And so this battle rages on for a little over a month into January 1945, where in the end the Allies are victorious. And with Hitler basically planning this whole attack and putting everything into this attack, he has expended his resources. He lost, you see at the bottom there, he loses 120,000 troops, 600 tanks / assault weapons, and over 1,600 planes. And these resources were resources that could not be replenished at this point. And just about 4 months later, you see the final falling of Germany. But we will look at that later on. But that is it for Section 5, the war over Europe. You'll see Section 6 will be posted here shortly, and that will be talking about the war in the Pacific Ocean.